All right, so today you are going to review how to find slope from a graph and write it as a linear function. And we are going to learn how to find slope from a table and write it as a linear function. So just a reminder, a linear function is a constant relationship between two variables. So the two variables that we are constantly having that relationship with are y and x. So a linear function has what we call a constant rate of change, which is why it always looks like a line on a graph that's continuing to go in both directions. There's one little typo here. We call this rate of change the slope. So we've been talking about slope for a few days now. So a linear function can be written as y equals mx. This is really important today, where m is the slope. So anytime you see the letter m now, you're going to replace it with the slope. So back on the very first day, we talked about how slope is rise over run when we're talking from a graph. So if you want to write yourself a little note, remember, on graphs, when we find slope, we find the rise over the run. But when we do it from a table, we call the slope the change in y over, like a fraction still, the change in x. So we're going to practice this here. And then we're also going to practice writing slope in the format y equals mx so that it's a linear function. So in this very first table, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look for the change in y over the change in x. So if you notice, tables are always written x, then y. So that means we have to find the pattern going across the y value first, whether it's on the bottom or on the right hand side of the table. We always look for the change in y first to put it on the top of our slope. So in this particular slope, I know going from 2 to 0 is minus 2, and 0 to negative 2 is another minus 2, and then negative 2 to negative 4, minus 2, so my change in y is minus 2. Then I'm going to look for my pattern going across x. So I look and I go, oh, well, negative 1 to 0 means I'm going up 1, and 0 to positive 1 plus 1, and 1 to 2 plus 1. So my change in x, or all the way across the x value of the table, is 1. Therefore, my slope is negative 2 over 1. And remember, up above, we talked about slope representing the letter m. So we now want to write this in the format y equals mx, where that m is the slope. So we change it to y equals negative 2 over 1 x. All right, let's take a look at the next example. Still keeping in mind we're dealing with rate of change, or y over x. So I'm going to look at my change in y first. And I'm going to look at my change in x second. So if I look at y, I can see that this is going down by, because it's going to a lower number, 0.4. And then when I go to 0.4 to 0, I'm continuing to show the same pattern or rate of change. And then when I go from 0 to negative 0.4, again, that's negative 0.4, or 4/10. Then when I look at the x value, when I go from negative 2 to 1, it's a positive 1. And when I go from negative 1 to 0, positive 1. And 0 to 1, positive 1. So my change in x is 1. Again, this is our slope, which is represented by the letter m. So when I write this as a linear function, I write it as y equals mx. So I take this negative 0.4 and I replace the letter m. Now remember, when I write fractions, and I didn't do it in the first example, I can take that 1 right here. That is not necessary. So again, also not necessary in that first example. So these are your two final linear equations. Let's do one more example with a table. Remember, we're talking change in x value first, or y value first, change in x value second. So I'm going to look at the y pattern. Going from 12 to 0 means I'm going down 12. Going from 0 to negative 12 means I'm going down another negative 12. And then this right here, I don't know why, but this cut off the 4 in the 24 to show that you're going down negative 12 again. So your change in y is negative 12. Then we're going to look at the change in x. Negative 1 to 0 plus 1. 0 to 1 plus 1. 1 to 2 plus 1. So our slope is negative 12 over 1. Remember, always represented by the letter m. So when I write this as a linear function, y equals mx, I replace that m with my negative 12. So y equals negative 12x, and that's our final linear function. So we've already learned how to find linear functions from graphs, but we haven't learned how to write it in the correct format. So we're going to go ahead and do that and review slope from a graph. So remember, when you find slope from a graph, you are connecting the 2 points to make a triangle, and then you are counting the rise over the run. So in this particular graph, I know there's a lot of grid lines, but you're just counting these main spaces right here. So that's 1, 2 spaces for the rise, and 2 spaces for the run, and it's going in a positive direction. So when we simplify that, we see that our slope is just equal to 1. So how do I write that? I write it in my y equals mx format. So y is equal to 1x. And there's your final slope and your final linear equation. Let's take a look at the next one. So when we connect our 2 dots together to make that right triangle. And again, I like to do it underneath my line. So I have my rise over my run. My rise is 3. My run is 1. Therefore, my slope is 3. And when I write that in y equals mx format, I get y equals 3x. So the only thing different between this and the lesson on finding slope from a graph is that you are writing in the final y equals mx format. All right, let's do another one. So you have your line going down here, you're going across to find your rise over your run. So your rise is 2 spaces down, and notice this is a negative slope where the other 2 were a positive slope. So this is a -2. And then I have 1, 2, 3, 4 for my run. So when I simplify that, I get -2 over 1. And then I need to write that in y equals mx. So I write that as y equals negative 1/2 x. Okay, we're gonna do 2 more. First one, connect to make your right triangle. Count your rise over your run. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is your rise. 1, 2, 3, 4 is your run. And when you simplify that by dividing by 2, you get 3 over 2. Y equals mx. I replace the 3 over 2 in for the m. So I get y equals 3 over 2x. Final format. All right, last one. Notice I noticed right off the bat, this is a negative slope. So I connect my 2 parts to my triangle. I count my rise first, then my run. So this is 1. And be careful here because these are counting. If you notice, this is 3. That's 1. Same thing goes down here. That's negative 3. That's negative 1. So they're counting by every 2 little grid spaces is 1. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is my rise. And then 1, 2, 3 is my run. And that was negative. No need to simplify, so I get y equals mx. I replace my m with negative 5 over 3x. And these are your final 2 for your rise and your rise over run and your linear function. So just to review, when you're finding slope from a table, you do the y values and you're finding the pattern or the change in y over the x values or the change in x to find your slope. You simplify your slope and you put it in the format y equals mx, where the fraction slope replaces the letter m. And then for a graph, when you find slope, you do rise over run, making your right triangle, and counting the spaces on the graph to find your rise over run and replacing that with m in the y equals mx format.